Welcome to Voluble Minds, reflections on and abbreviated readings of famous philosophical dialogues. I'm Colin Wulff, Assistant Director of Religious Education at the Fourth Universalist Society in New York City. If you would like to skip the introductory segment on today's philosopher and dialogue and go straight to the reading, the timestamp posted in the video description will help you to do that. Thank you for joining us. Today, we will be reading and examining selections from Galileo Galilei's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. Galileo Galilei lived from 1564 to 1642, so our 700-year leap from Plato to Boethius becomes more than a 1,000-year leap from there to Galileo. He may not have previously registered for many of our viewers as a philosopher so much as a scientist, yet considering what was then a rudimentary stage of what we now refer to as the scientific method, he could rightly be given a now somewhat outmoded designation, that of natural philosopher. Of course, we still use the title Doctor of Philosophy to describe a high level of qualification in most academic fields, philosophy literally meaning love of wisdom. It's just that we now understand science more specifically as the objective process of understanding the natural world. Galileo is among the thinkers we can thank for that. Galileo is most popularly remembered for his facilitating understandings of gravity and heliocentrism, as well as contributing to the practice of observational astronomy. He left behind a large summary of many of his ideas in his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. The two world systems that are in question are that of the Aristotle-influenced geocentric Ptolemaic system and the heliocentric, sun-centered Copernican system, Galileo touting the latter. Galileo is remembered less fondly by some for his propitiations to the Catholic Church, which may have gained him mere house arrest instead of the fiery death his predecessor Giordano Bruno faced for his heresies. Keep an ear out for Galileo's attempted and not wholly successful genuflections to the religious powers, both human and supernal, in the course of this dialogue, as he attempts somehow to overturn their worldview in terms palatable to them. Albert Einstein, in his introduction to an English translation of this dialogue, though not the one we're using, describes Galileo's efforts to walk this tightrope as roguish. On that note of not deifying Galileo as an icon of scientific inerrancy, Einstein also criticizes him for neglecting to assimilate or cite Johannes Kepler's determination of planetary orbits into his work in defending the Copernican model. Einstein chalks this up to, in his words, the fact that creative individuals are often not receptive. But perhaps it's fairer to wonder if Kepler's less mingled enthusiasm for religious reconciliation and his less scrupulous dabbling with Platonic and Aristotelian dictates aroused Galileo's suspicions on this count, however useful Kepler's elliptical adjustment to the laws of planetary motion may have been in their joint cause. However, Einstein also has his more affectionate reflection on Galileo's attitude and legacy, writing, the leitmotif which I recognize in Galileo's work is the passionate fight against any kind of dogma based on authority. Only experience and careful reflection are accepted by him as criteria of truth. Galileo himself is not named within this dialogue. Some of his works are referenced, however. The scientific arguments are placed in a context of what were then living debates, such as Aristotle's the so-called peripatetic school regarding fixed spheres and Earth's centrality. Thus, a lot of time is spent criticizing assumptions most of us no longer hold, again, in part thanks to Galileo. Uncut, this is the longest dialogue in our series, and I have left out some interminable sections of purely geometrical demonstrations. The irony of so much of this material aging better in objective terms than the more metaphysical or imaginative material of our series is that we now so take it for granted that we may be less stimulated by reviewing it, especially in this somewhat impenetrable and translated Renaissance style. At least in dialogue, irresponsible sprees of speculation can sometimes appear livelier than clinical descriptions of subtended angles. But Einstein, in that admirable foreword, reminds us that even modern science, and this still applies, is actually more reflective of a blended speculative and empirical approach. For how else are mechanisms and models for further study to be developed in their initial absence? It isn't quite right to regard Galileo as helping to supplant speculation with observation, but rather to think of him as helping to make observation an accomplice to speculation, one we are lucky to be increasingly aided by through technology and developing methods as time goes on. The scientific method, as it is taught from textbooks today, often belies the creativity and abstract thinking so essential to its advancement. Occasionally, propositions must be assumed in order to test further ones, and yet assumptions about the nature of scientific assumption result too often in a mistaken interpretation of words like theory as being exclusively speculative. Thus, we get an abundant supply of false contrasts prompted by some religious circles, even some liberal and humanistic ones, between our capacities for qualitative, subjective, imaginative fulfillment and a rigorous attention to and respect for objective scientific enterprise. And it is this trend, this contrived mix up, that Galileo seems eager to forestall, as shown in this epigraph, in his own words, published at the head of this dialogue. He writes, "Take note, theologians, that in your desire to make matters of faith out of propositions related to the fixity of sun and earth, you run the risk of eventually having to condemn as heretics those who would declare the earth to stand still and the sun to change position. Eventually, I say, at such a time as it might be physically or logically proved that the earth moves and the sun stands still." In Galileo's dialogue, Simplicius, probably inspired by a real-life Neoplatonist and Aristotelian scholar of the same name, is the Aristotelian Ptolemaic strawman. Salviati is Galileo's mouthpiece, who combats and dismantles the old Aristotelian view of planetary behavior. And then we have Sagredus, an impartial listener for whose opinion the other two seem somewhat in contest. We will be using Thomas Salisbury's 1661 translation from Italian to English, and it is in the public domain. Now, because this is a mid-17th century translation, though in our tongue it soundeth not so clear to our ear. But that is why I have invited on two excellent Shakespearean actors to join me, Matthew Tyler and Jess Bedwinek, reading Simplicius and Sagredus respectively to my Salviati. Jess has a master's in theater from the New School in NYC, and Matt also works as a photographer for events, families, and actor headshots. If you would like to stick around after the dialogue, there will be a brief post-dialogue discussion on Galileo as the vehicle for exploring two chief theatrical systems. We open with Sagredus questioning Salviati, not shown at first, about his skepticism against Aristotle's planetary conceits. Before Salviati can reply, Simplicius rushes to Aristotle's defense, and we're off. Enjoy Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems.
Pardon me, Salviati. Since you say that if Aristotle denies circular motion to the earth in common with other celestial bodies, it thence will follow that the same which befalleth the earth, as to its being generable, alterable, etc., will hold also of heaven. Let us inquire no further if there be such things in nature as generation and corruption or not. But let us to return to inquire what the globe of the earth doth.
I cannot suffer my ears to hear it questioned, whether generation and corruption be in rerum natura, it being a thing which we have continually before our eyes, and whereof Aristotle hath written 2 whole books. But if you go about to deny the principles of science and question things most manifest, who knows not but that you may prove what you will and maintain any paradox? And if you do not daily see herbs, plants, animals to generate and corrupt, what is it that you do see? Also, do you not continually behold contrarieties contended together, and the earth changed into water, water turned to air, air into fire, and again the air to condense into clouds, rains, hails, and storms?
Yes, we see these things indeed, and therefore will grant you the discourse of Aristotle as to this part of generation and corruption made by contraries. But if I shall conclude by virtue the same propositions which are granted to Aristotle, that the celestial bodies themselves are also generable and corruptible, as well as the elementary, what will you say then?
I will say that you have done that which is impossible to be done.
Go to. Tell me, Simplicius, are not these affections contrary to one another?
Which?
Why, these. Alterable, unalterable, passable, impassable, generable, ingenerable, corruptible, and incorruptible.
They are most contrary.
Well, then, if these be true, and it also be granted that celestial bodies are ingenerable and incorruptible, I prove that of necessity, celestial bodies must be generable and corruptible.
This must needs be sophism.
Hear my argument, and then censure and resolve it. Celestial bodies, for that they are ingenerable and incorruptible, have in nature their contraries, which are those bodies that be generable and corruptible. And where there is contrariety, there is also generation and corruption. Therefore, celestial bodies are generable and corruptible.
Did I not say it could be no other than a sophism? This is one of those fort arguments called soriety, like that of the Cretan, who said that all Cretans were liars, but he, being a Cretan, had told a lie in saying that the Cretans were liars. It followed, therefore, that the Cretans were no liars, and consequently, that he, as being a Cretan, had spoke truth. And yet, in saying the Cretans were liars, he had said true, and comprehending himself as a Cretan, he must consequently be a liar. And thus, in these kinds of sophisms, a man may dwell to eternity and never come to any conclusion. But I will make trial of myself for my own falsification, whether I can reconcile that which experience shows us with that which Aristotle teaches us. For it's a certain maxim that two truths cannot be contrary to one another.
If you would reconcile that which sense showeth you with the more solid doctrines of Aristotle, you will find it no great difficulty in the undertaking. Doth not Aristotle say that one cannot treat confidently of the things of heaven by reason of their great remoteness?
He expressly saith so.
And doth he not likewise affirm that we ought to prefer that which sense demonstrates before all arguments, though in appearance never so well grounded?
He doth so. Why then, the second of these propositions, which are both the doctrine of Aristotle that saith that sense is to take place of logic, is a doctrine much more solid and undoubted than that other which holdeth the heavens to be unalterable. And therefore, you shall argue more Aristotelianly, saying, the heavens are alterable, for that my sense telleth me. That if you should say the heavens are unalterable, for that logic so persuaded Aristotle.
We inquire, Simplicius, whether to the making of a reflection of light, like that which we receive from the moon, it be necessary that the superficies from whence the reflection cometh be so smooth and polite as the face of a looking glass, or whether superficies not smooth or polished, but rough and uneven, be more apt for such a purpose. Now, supposing two reflections should come unto us, one more bright, the other less, from two surfaces opposite unto us, I demand of you, which of the two surfaces you think would represent itself to our sight to be the clearest, and which the obscurest?
I'm very confident that that same which most forcibly reflected the light upon me would show itself in its aspect, the clearer, and the other darker.
Be pleased to take that glass which hangs on yonder wall, and let us go out into the courtyard. Come, Sagredus. Now hang the glass yonder against that same wall under which the sun shines, and now let us withdraw ourselves into the shade. See yonder two surfaces beaten by the sun, namely the wall and the glass. Tell me now, which appears clearest unto you, that of the wall or that of the glass? Why do you not answer me?
I leave the reply to Simplicius, who made the question. But I, for my own part, am persuaded upon this small beginning of the experiment that the moon must be of a very unpolished surface.
What say you, Simplicius? If you were to show that wall in a painting with that glass fastened onto it, where would you use your darkest colors, in rendering the wall or else in painting the looking glass?
Much the darker in rendering the glass.
Now, if from the surface, which represents itself more clear, there proceedeth a more powerful reflection of light, the wall will more forcibly reflect the rays of the sun than the glass.
Very well, sir. Have you ever a better experiment than this? You have placed us where the glass doth not reverberate upon us, but come along with me a little this way. How will you not stir?
You perhaps seek the place of the reflection which the glass maketh.
I do.
Why, look you, there it is upon the opposite wall, just as big as the glass, and little less bright than if the sun had directly shined upon it.
Come hither, therefore, and see from hence the surface of the glass, and tell me whether you think it more obscure than that of the wall.
Look on it yourself, for I have no mind at this time to dazzle my eyes, and I know very well, without seeing it, that it there appears as splendid and bright as the sun itself, or a little less.
What say you, therefore? Is the reflection of a glass less powerful than that of a wall? I see that in this opposite wall, where the reflection of the other illuminated wall comes together with that of the glass, this of the glass is much clearer. And I see likewise that from this place where I stand, the glass itself appears with much more luster than the wall.
You have prevented me with your subtlety, for I stood in need of this very observation to demonstrate what remains. You see then the difference which happens betwixt the two reflections made by the two surfaces of the wall and glass, lit upon in the self-same manner by the rays of the sun. And you see how the reflection which comes from the wall diffuseth itself towards all the parts opposite to it, but that of the glass goeth towards one part only, not at all bigger than the glass itself. You see likewise how the surfaces of the wall, beheld from what part soever, always shows itself of one and the same clearness, and every way much clearer than that of the glass, excepting only in that little place on which the glass's reflection reverberates, for from thence indeed the glass appears much more lucid than the wall. By these so sensible and palpable experiments, methinks one may soon come to know whether the reflection which the moon sends upon us proceeds as from a glass, or else as from a wall, that is, from a smooth surface or a rugged.
If I were the moon itself, I think, I could not with my hands more plainly feel the unevenness of its surfaces than I do now perceive it by apprehending your discourse. I demand first of Simplicius, whether he believeth that diverse motions may naturally agree to one and the same movable body, or else that it be requisite its natural and proper motion by only one.
To one single movable body, there can naturally agree but one sole motion and no more. The rest all happen accidentally and by participation. Like as to him that walketh upon the deck of a ship, his proper motion is that of his walk, his motion by participation, that which carrieth him to his port, whither he would never with his walking have arrived, if the ship with its motion had not wafted him thither.
Tell me secondly, that motion which is communicated to any movable by participation, whilst it moveth by itself with another motion different from the participated, is it necessary that it do reside in some certain subject by itself, or else can it subsist in nature alone without other support?
Aristotle giveth you an answer to all these questions and tells you that as of one sole movable, the motion is but one. So of one sole motion, the movable is but one. And consequently, that without the inherence in its subject, no motion can either subsist or be imagined.
I would have you tell me, in the third place, whether you believe that the moon and the other planets and celestial bodies have their proper motions, and what they are.
So they have, and they be those according to which they run through the zodiac. The moon in a month, the sun in a year, Mars in 2, the starry sphere in those so many thousand, and these are their proper and natural motions.
But that motion wherewith I see the fixed stars, and with him all the planets go unitedly from east to west, and return round to the east again in 24 hours, how doth it agree with them?
It suiteth with them by participation.
This then resides not in them, and not residing in them, nor being able to subsist without some subject in which it is resident, it must of force be the proper and natural motion of some other sphere.
For this purpose, astronomers and philosophers have found another high sphere, above all the rest without stars, to which diurnal motion naturally agrees. And this they call the primum mobile, which carrieth along with it all the inferior spheres, contributing and imparting its motion to them.
But when, without introducing other spheres unknown and hugely vast, without other motions or communicated raptures, with leaving to each sphere its sole and simple motions, without intermixing contrary motions, but making all turn one way as it is necessary that they do, depending all upon one sole principle, all things proceed orderly and correspond with most perfect harmony, why do we reject this phenomenon and give our assent to those prodigious and laborious conditions?
The difficulty lieth in finding out this so natural and expeditious way.
In my judgment, this is found. Make the earth the primum mobile, that is, make it turn round its own axis in 24 hours, and toward the same point with all the other spheres, and without participating this same motion to any other planet or star, all shall have their risings, settings, and, in a word, their other appearances.
The business is to be able to make the earth move without 1,000 inconveniences.
All the inconveniences shall be removed as fast as you propound them, and the things spoken hitherto are only the primacy and more general inducements which give us to believe that the diurnal conversion may, not altogether without probability, be applied to the earth, rather than to all the rest of the universe.
But having a respect to the strength of the mover, which is infinite, it is no less easy to move the universe than the earth, yea, than a straw. And if his power is infinite, why should he not rather exercise a greater part thereof than a less? Therefore, I hold that your discourse in general is not convincing.
If I had at any time said that the universe moved not for want of power in the mover, I should have erred. I grant you that to an infinite power it is as easy to move 100,000 as one, but that which I say concerns not the mover, but only hath respect to the movables, and in them not only to their resistance, which doubtless is lesser in the earth than in the universe, but to what you say in the next place, that of an infinite power it is better to exercise a great part than a small. I answer that of the infinite, one part is not greater than another, since both are infinite. But if we respect only the movables, there's no question that it is a shorter and easier way to move the earth than the universe. Let us return to our principal matter, in which there presents itself for our consideration the annual motion commonly ascribed to the sun, but by Aristarchus Samius, first of all, and after by Copernicus, taken from the sun and transferred upon the earth, against which hypothesis methinks I see Simplicius to come strongly provided with sword and buckler, and likewise Sagredus, with the vivacity of his wit, shall interpose his thoughts as he shall find himself inclined.
I will do it with my wonted freedom, and your commands shall oblige you to excuse me in doing so.
The favor will call for thanks, and not an excuse. But now let Simplicius begin to propose those doubts which dissuade him from believing that the earth, in like manner as the other planets, may move around a fixed center.
The first and greatest difficulty is the repugnance and incompatibility that is between being in the center and being far from it. For if the terrestrial globe were to move in a year by the circumference of a circle that is under the zodiac, it is impossible that it should at the same time be in the center of the zodiac. But that the earth is in the said center, Aristotle, Ptolemy, and others have many ways proved.
You very well argue, and there is no question but that one who would make the earth to move in the circumference of a circle must first, of necessity, prove that it is not the center of that same circle. It now followeth that we inquire whether the earth be or be not in that center about which I say that it turneth, and you say that it is fixed. And before we speak of this, it's likewise necessary that we declare ourselves whether you and I have both the same conceit of this center or no. Therefore, tell me, what and where is this your intended center?
When I speak of the center, I mean that of the universe, that of the world, that of the starry sphere.
Although I might very rationally put it in dispute whether there be any such center in nature or no, being that neither you nor anyone else hath ever proved whether the world be finite and figurate or else infinite and interminate, yet, nevertheless, granting you for the present that it is finite and of a terminate spherical figure, and that thereupon it hath its center, it will be requisite to see how credible it is that the earth and not rather some other body doth possess the said center.
That the world is finite, terminate, and spherical, Aristotle proveth with 100 demonstrations.
all which in the end are reduced to one alone, and that one to none at all. For if I deny his assumptions, to wit, that the universe is movable, all his demonstrations come to nothing. For he only proveth the universe to be finite and terminate, for that it is movable. Both Mars and Venus seem unequal to themselves according to the proportions assigned, and Venus under the sun seemeth horned and goeth changing figures in itself, exactly like the moon.
But how came this to be concealed from Copernicus and revealed to you?
These things cannot be comprehended save only by the sense of seeing, the which by nature was not granted to man so perfect as that it was able to attain to the discovery of such differences. Nay, even the very instrument of sight is an impediment to itself. But since that it hath pleased God in our age to vouchsafe to human ingenuity so admirable an invention for perfecting our sight, by multiplying it 4, 6, 10, 20, 30, and 40 times infinite objects that either by reason of their distance or for their extreme smallness were invisible to us, have, by the help of the telescope, been rendered visible.
But Venus and Mars are none of the objects invisible for their distance or smallness. Yea, we do discern them with our bare natural sight. Why then do we not distinguish the difference of their magnitude and figures?
In this, the impediment of our very eye itself hath a great share, as but even now I hinted, by which the resplendent and remote objects are not represented to us simple and pure, but gives them as fringed with strange and adventitious rays, so long and dense that their naked body showeth to us aggrandized 10, 20, 100, yea, 1,000 times more than it would appear if the capillaceous crown-like rays were taken away.
I must confess that I never had the curiosity nor given any great credit to the telescope newly introduced, rather treading in the steps of other peripatetic philosophers. I have thought those things to fallacies and delusions of the crystals, which others have so much admired for stupendous operations.
The confidence that these men have in their own apprehensions is no less unreasonable than the small esteem they have of the judgments of others. Yet it's much that they should esteem themselves able to judge such an instrument without ever having made trial of it against those who have made and daily do make 1,000 experiments of the same. But I pray you, let us leave this kind of pertinacious men, whom we cannot so much as tax without doing them too great honor. Now, because it is time to put an end to our discourses, I am to give thanks to Sagredus for your courteous affection, and of Simplicius I ask pardon, if I have former times moved you with my too bold and resolute speaking.
There is no reason why you should make all these excuses. They are needless, and especially to me, that being accustomed to be at a conferences and public disputes, have 100 times seen the disputants not only grow hot and angry at one another, but likewise to break forth into injurious words, and sometimes to come very near to blows. As for the past discourses, and particularly in this last of the reason of the ebbing and flowing of the sea, I do not, to speak the truth, very well apprehend the same. But I know that both of you being asked whether God, by his infinite power and wisdom, might confer upon the element of water the reciprocal motion which we observe in it in any other way than by making the containing vessel to move. I know that you will answer that he might, and that he knew how to have done the same many ways, and those unimaginable to our shallow understanding, upon which I forthwith conclude that this being granted, it would be an extravagant boldness for anyone to go about to limit and confine the divine power and wisdom to some one particular conjecture of his own.
This of yours is an admirable and truly angelical doctrine. Let therefore the disquisition permitted and ordained us by God assist us in the knowing, and so much more admiring his greatness, by how much less we find ourselves too dull to penetrate the profound abysses of his infinite wisdom.
And may this serve for a final close of our 4 days of disputations. And now we may, according to our custom, spend an hour in taking the air in the gondola that waiteth for us.
Welcome to the post-dialogue reflection. I first came across Galileo's dialogue as a self-guided follow-up to reading his life and accomplishments and failures expressed in another form of dialogue, the one we have sworn off in this series, dramatic literature, specifically Bertolt Brecht's Galileo. In that play, Galileo is seen as a pragmatic survivor, neither craven nor courageous so much as doing his best to promote his views given the pressures exerted on him by the Vatican and the social currents, alignments, and biases of his time, not to mention his duties as a father. This portrayal exemplifies what many who have studied Brecht's artistic impact have chosen to emphasize in his approach to characterization. The characters are the object of social circumstances rather than empowered agents influencing their environments. And yet, given Galileo's legacy in promoting our knowledge of planetary motion and Earth's own place in a larger universe, one could be forgiven for not seeing in this story a mere victim of circumstance, of insuperable planetary motions. A different, more martyrly narrative could be spun without much difficulty. Thus, by an implied converse, two theatrical systems are suggested in Brecht's play, as two world systems are suggested in the dialogue we just explored. As Salviati's Copernicanism confronted Simplicius's Aristotelian physics, a hypothetical Galileo of Aristotelian poetics, the one represented somewhat in our cultural memory, opposes itself, in theory, to the Galileo of Brechtian poetics. In the former, we might imagine our heroic protagonist tragically fixed within the story's motions, but nonetheless central to their orbit. In the latter, Galileo is rather caught in the orbit of focal forces external to him, thus decentering him to being just one of many such gravitationally enthralled planetary bodies. Does he deserve to be so diminished in the grand scheme, given his elucidation of that grand scheme? Deserving may not factor into it, but it is worth remembering, whatever his motive, that Galileo goes unnamed in his own dialogic composition, choosing instead to center the very ideas which stand to humble all earthlings. Thanks for staying for the post-dialogue segment.